The dress arrived on a Thursday morning, which I found out later was not a coincidence. I was in the middle of a patient consultation when my phone buzzed. My hospital administrator, which was unusual enough that I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. The delivery had been left with security downstairs. A white garment bag, no return address, my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Clean, deliberate strokes. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who learned penmanship from a strict private school teacher and never forgot it. I didn't open it until my lunch break. By then, I had already convinced myself it was a mistake, that someone had sent it to the wrong Dr. Aldane at Portland General. It wasn't a mistake. Inside was a gown, floor-length, silk charmeuse, pale ivory, the kind of thing that costs more than my monthly student loan payment. Tucked beneath the hanger was a card, cream-colored, embossed at the top, with initials I recognized immediately, NH. My stomach dropped so fast I had to sit down on the break room bench. Nathan Holt. I hadn't spoken to Nathan Holt in 11 months. Let me back up, because this story doesn't make sense without the year that came before it, and the year before that doesn't make sense without my father. My dad, Gerald Aldane, 63 years old, retired school principal, the most decent man I have ever known, had a heart attack 2 Novembers ago. Not his first. He'd had a minor one at 58 that we all pretended was a warning, and then quietly forgot about. Because he was fine, he said everything was fine, he'd cut back on salt. He didn't cut back on salt. He also didn't tell us that he'd been borrowing against his retirement account to cover what he described. When I finally cornered him in his hospital room with my arms crossed, and my voice very controlled as some investments that didn't pan out the way I'd hoped. Investments. $340,000, gone. Some of it in a real estate venture that folded, some of it in a business loan he'd co-signed for my cousin Tommy, who had never in his life demonstrated any talent for business, and had, in fact, spent most of his adult life demonstrating a considerable talent for the opposite. The rest, and this is the part that kept me awake that first night in the hospital chair beside my father's bed, the rest was owed to a private lending group, not a bank. A private lending group, which is the polite way of saying a creditor with no obligation to be polite back. I was 31. I was 4 years out of medical school. I had a studio apartment in the Pearl District, a used Honda Civic, and approximately $18,000 in savings that I had been hoarding with the ferocity of someone who had spent her 20s eating instant noodles and working nights. My father looked at me from his hospital bed with the expression of a man who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "I didn't want to worry you," he said. I took his hand. I didn't say anything, because if I opened my mouth I was going to cry, and I had promised myself in the parking garage that I wasn't going to cry until I was back in my car. I cried in the parking garage, and then I drove home, and I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and I started trying to figure out how to save my father's retirement. That's how I ended up at a meeting with Nathan Holt. I want to be accurate about who Nathan Holt was at the point when I walked into his office building on a gray February morning with my resume, my father's financial documentation, and a pitch that I had rehearsed 47 times in my bathroom mirror. He was 44. He ran Holt Capital, which was not flashy in the way that finance companies sometimes are. No glass towers, no aggressive branding, no mentions in the tech press. It was the kind of firm that didn't need to advertise because the people who needed to know about it already did. He had built it from a regional investment fund into something considerably larger over about 15 years, through a combination of, depending on who you asked, exceptional instinct, calculated ruthlessness, or the kind of patience that most people mistake for coldness. I had done my research. I knew he had a reputation for being difficult. I knew he had turned down 3 hospital endowment requests in the past 2 years, because he felt the proposals were structurally inadequate, which was apparently his way of saying he thought the people asking him for money hadn't thought hard enough about what they were going to do with it. I was not asking him for a donation. I had a different proposal. His assistant, a composed woman named Helen, who had the energy of someone who has survived every kind of workplace chaos and come out the other side faintly amused by all of it, showed me into the conference room at exactly 9 a.m. He was already there. He stood when I came in, which I hadn't expected. And he was taller than I'd expected too. Though I don't know why I would have expected anything. Dark suit, no tie, a stillness about him that I would come to recognize as his default setting. Not boredom, not coldness, something more like a person who had trained themselves to take up less space than they actually occupied. "Dr. Aldane," he said. "Mr. Holt." I set my folder on the table and sat down across from him. "Thank you for meeting with me. You submitted a fairly unusual proposal," he said. He hadn't opened the folder in front of him. He was looking at me with the particular attention of someone who has already read every piece of paper in the room and is now more interested in the person than the paperwork. Most people who want a private loan don't offer to work off the interest. Most people who want a private loan don't have a specific skill set that might be useful to the lender, I said. "I do." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Walk me through it." So I did. The proposal was this. Holt Capital would cover my father's debt, the full $340,000, including the private lender, in exchange for a 2-year contract in which I would serve as the on-call physician for Holt Capital's executive team and their families. Full-time availability, on-site medical suite, quarterly health assessments, emergency response. I would maintain my position at Portland General on a reduced schedule. The contract would be structured as a service agreement, which meant it was legally clean and didn't require me to give up my medical license or my professional independence. I had consulted a healthcare attorney before I walked into that room. I had made sure every clause was right. Nathan Holt listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for long enough that I started mentally preparing for a polite no. Then he said, "Your father knows you're here?" I hesitated. "No." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the recognition of something he hadn't anticipated. "And if I say no?" "Then I'll find another way," I said. "But I think this arrangement benefits both of us, and I think you know that, or you wouldn't have taken the meeting." He looked at me for another moment. Then he opened the folder. We signed the contract 3 days later. The first 6 months were professional to the point of impersonality, which suited me fine. I saw him at quarterly assessments, and when he summoned me for someone on his team, which happened more often than I'd expected. There were 12 executives and their families under the contract, and between a CFO with untreated hypertension, a VP of acquisitions with a stress-induced ulcer that he kept insisting was just heartburn, and Nathan's own mother, who had a complicated cardiac history and lived 20 minutes from the office, I was reasonably busy. Nathan himself I saw less than anyone. He showed up for his own assessments on schedule, answered my questions directly, followed medical advice with the compliance of someone who viewed his own health as a logistical problem to be managed. He had a blood pressure that ran slightly high, which didn't surprise me. He slept poorly, which also didn't surprise me. He was not a man who let himself be worried about. And when I told him that chronic sleep deprivation had measurable long-term consequences, he looked at me with the expression of someone receiving information they already knew and had already decided to manage later. "I'm not your highest risk patient," he said. "Your CFO's hypertension is actively dangerous," I agreed, "but that doesn't make yours irrelevant." He looked at me for a moment, then, and this was the first time I saw it, the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the precursor to one. "Fair point, Dr. Aldane." I went home that evening and did not think about the way he said my name, or I tried not to. The thing about spending 2 years in close proximity to someone is that you learn them whether you mean to or not. I learned that Nathan arrived at the office before his assistant and left after his security detail. I learned that he ate lunch at his desk almost every day, and that he had a standing order from a deli 3 blocks away for the same turkey and Swiss on rye. No mustard, which I found oddly humanizing. I learned that he had a younger sister who called him every Sunday, and that when her number appeared on his phone, whatever he was doing stopped. I learned that he had a house in the West Hills, with a view he never had time to look at, and that he kept a copy of a Wendell Berry essay collection on his desk, which surprised me enough the first time I noticed it that I said, without meaning to, "I didn't picture you as a Wendell Berry reader." He looked up from his work. "What did you picture?" I felt a flush creep up the back of my neck. "Financial reports," I said. He looked back down. "I read those too," he said, but the corner of his mouth moved again. I started noticing other things. The way he always held the elevator for people, even when he was clearly in a hurry, and did it without looking like he expected to be thanked for it. The way he talked to Helen, not like an assistant, like a person whose opinion he actually valued. The way he visited his mother every other weekend without fail. And once, when I ran into him at the hospital, where she was having a cardiology follow-up, he had a paperback in his jacket pocket, and 2 coffees, and the look of a man who had reorganized his entire afternoon and wasn't going to mention it. I stopped telling myself I wasn't thinking about him. I started telling myself it didn't matter. The problem arrived in month 14. His name was Drew Whitfield, and he was a venture capitalist who had been trying to acquire a stake in one of Holt Capital's portfolio companies for the better part of a year. He came to a charity gala that Nathan's firm sponsored every fall. I was there in a professional capacity. The firm covered medical support for large events. It was in the contract. And Drew Whitfield found me at the drinks table and decided, within approximately 4 minutes of conversation, that I was the most interesting person at the party. I was polite. I was also, I'll admit, a little flattered, because Drew Whitfield was charming in the practiced way of someone who has spent years being attractive in expensive rooms, and it had been a while since someone had aimed that kind of attention at me without a copay attached. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. He asked for my number. I said I'd think about it, which was honest. The following Monday, Nathan asked me to come to his office for what he described as a contract-related matter. "Is something wrong?" I asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. Not exactly. He was looking at his desk. Then he looked up, and there was something different in his expression. The controlled quality was still there, but underneath it something pulled tight. The Whitfield conversation at the gala. I stared at him. "Excuse me?" "Drew Whitfield," he said carefully, "has a complicated history with this firm. I should have briefed you on guests who might present a conflict of interest." A pause. "I'm sorry I didn't." I looked at him. This was, I realized, the most elaborate way anyone had ever come close to telling me something without telling me anything at all. "Is there a professional concern?" I asked. "About me speaking with him?" A beat. "Not professionally, no. Then what kind of concern is it?" He didn't answer right away. He picked up a pen, set it back down. Nathan Holt, who made multi-million-dollar decisions without visible hesitation, could not seem to finish a sentence. "Never mind," he said finally. "I apologize for the confusion." I walked out of his office and stood in the hallway for a full minute, trying to understand what had just happened. I did not call Drew Whitfield. I didn't examine that decision too carefully. The next 4 months were different, in a way I couldn't name precisely. Nathan started stopping by the medical suite occasionally, not for anything clinical. To drop off information about a health initiative he was considering, he said, or to follow up on his mother's recent labs, he said. Or once because he was passing by and wanted to know if I had any concerns about the team before the upcoming travel schedule. These were plausible reasons. I had plausible responses to them. We would talk for 10 or 15 minutes, and then he would leave. And I would sit there for a moment, before I remembered what I had been doing. Helen told me once, passing me in the corridor, with the faint amusement that seemed to be her permanent expression, "He's been much more interested in preventive health since you joined us." I didn't know what to do with that. The gown arrived on a Thursday in September, 11 months before the end of my contract. I went to his office that afternoon. Helen waved me through without calling ahead, which she had never done before. Nathan was standing at the window when I came in, his back to me, looking out at the city. He turned when he heard me, and he looked different. Some of the controlled quality was gone. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something. I held up the garment bag. "This came this morning," I said, "with your initials on the card." He looked at the bag, then at me. "I know. I don't understand what it is." "There's an event," he said. "The firm's annual dinner. Black tie. I've been going alone for 11 years. He paused. "I'd like you to come with me, not as a company physician." Another pause longer. As my guest, I stood there. "Nathan," I said, and his name felt different in my mouth now that I'd used it. I had been calling him Mr. Holt for 17 months, and the change was small and enormous at the same time. The contract ends in 7 months. I know when the contract ends. My father's debt is almost cleared. I know that too. So why? "Because," he said, and he stopped. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth briefly, the gesture of a man carefully choosing words. I have been trying to be patient. I have been trying to respect the professional arrangement and your independence and every reasonable boundary that existed between us, and I think I have done that. A beat. I also think I have been extraordinarily patient for a very long time, and I would like to stop pretending that I asked Helen to reschedule 3 meetings. The day you told me about your father's second hospitalization, or that I read that Wendell Berry essay I left on my desk because I thought you might see it and say something about it, or that the Whitfield conversation at the gala is the only reason I cannot stand the thought of Drew Whitfield. He looked at me. I'm not good at this. I want to be honest with you about that. The garment bag was heavy in my hands. When did it start? I asked. The patience. He looked at the window, then back at me. February, he said. The morning you walked into my conference room with a legal pad and a prepared argument, and told me that if I said no, you'd find another way. February. 2 years ago. You signed the contract 3 days later, I said. I needed to verify some things about the terms, he said carefully, and then added, quieter, and I needed 3 days to accept the fact that you were going to be here every day, and I was going to have to behave professionally. Something happened to my chest, a loosening, a shift, the feeling of something I had been bracing against for months finally giving way. I don't know what to do with this, I said honestly. You don't have to do anything tonight, he said, but I would very much like you to come to dinner. I looked at the garment bag. I looked at him. I need to try the dress on first, I said, to see if it fits. He nodded and turned back to the window, and I went to the small washroom adjoining the conference room and unzipped the garment bag with hands that were not entirely steady. The gown slid out like water. I put it on, which took several minutes, and a significant degree of spatial reasoning that medical school had not prepared me for, and when I finally got the last closure fastened, I stood in front of the mirror for a moment. I looked like someone who had been waiting for something, without knowing it. I went back to his office. Nathan turned from the window when he heard me come in, and something happened to his face. All of it, all at once, the way still water changes when something breaks the surface. He didn't say anything for a moment. Does it fit? I asked. I didn't know what else to say. He looked at me the way people look at things they have been trying not to look at for a very long time. Yes, he said. It fits. We went to the dinner. We went to a lot of things after that. I finished the contract in April and my father's debt was cleared the following week, exactly as agreed. Nathan sent the confirmation paperwork over with Helen, who included a handwritten note of her own at the bottom that said, "Took him long enough." She signed it with just her name and no explanation. My father, when I finally told him the whole story, the contract, the debt, the 17 months of professional distance, all of it, was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "You did all of that for me." "You would have done it for me," I said. He looked at me with the expression I remembered from the hospital bed, but different now, lighter. "I should have told you sooner. About the money, yes," I said. "You should have." I took his hand. "But we're okay now." He nodded slowly. Then, with the timing my father had always had, he said, "So this Nathan Holt, is he treating you right?" "He's trying," I said. "He's not always good at showing it, but he tries." I thought about 3 meetings rescheduled, an essay collection left on a desk, a garment bag with a handwritten card delivered on a Thursday for no other reason than that he had finally decided to stop waiting. "Yes," I said. "He tries." My father squeezed my hand. "That counts for something," he said. "It counts for a lot, actually. More than I knew how to say at the time. More than I still fully know how to say now. But I'm learning."